It started with a single knock. The kind of knock that sends a chill down your spine, not because it's particularly loud, but because it feels wrong. Mark had been living alone for just a few months. His new house was nothing special, a small, two-bedroom rental in the suburbs. He had moved there after his breakup, hoping that a quiet neighborhood would help him get back on track. The place was cozy, if not a little outdated, with old wooden floors that creaked even when he wasn't walking on them. He had no close neighbors. The houses on his street were spaced apart, and the only sign of life at night was the occasional flicker of a television screen behind drawn curtains. He liked the solitude, or at least he thought he did. But then came the knock. It was just past midnight, and Mark was watching a late-night horror movie, half asleep on his couch. When he first heard it, he thought it was part of the film, a deep, rhythmic knocking. But when he muted the TV, it continued. Knock, knock, knock. A slow, deliberate tapping against his front door. Mark frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. In fact, he hadn't spoken to anyone all day. He checked his phone. No missed calls, no messages. The knocking came again. He hesitated before standing up. His mind immediately tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a neighbor in need of help, or maybe someone had the wrong house. But then, another thought crept in. The thought that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Who knocks at midnight? Peering through the peephole, he expected to see a confused delivery driver or maybe a lost teenager. But there was no one, just the empty porch, the dim glow of his porch light barely illuminating the quiet street. Mark exhaled, shaking his head. Probably just kids playing pranks. He turned away. Knock, knock. This time, it was louder, closer. His heart pounded. He quickly turned back, staring through the peephole again. Still no one. A cold chill slithered down his spine. He double-checked that the door was locked and backed away. Maybe he was just tired, his mind playing tricks on him. Deciding to ignore it, he returned to his couch and turned the volume back up. But the moment he sat down, knock, knock, his breath caught in his throat. Something was wrong. A thought he didn't want to entertain crawled into his mind like a spider weaving a web. Was the knocking getting closer? It wasn't frantic. It wasn't aggressive. It was patient, like something was waiting. He tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a branch tapping against the door, or an animal, or knock. This time, it came from the back door. Mark froze. That door led to the backyard, enclosed by a tall wooden fence. No one should be able to get back there. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, but his fingers felt numb as he approached the sliding glass door. He swallowed, his throat dry. The backyard was still. The only movement was the gentle swaying of trees in the night breeze. Nothing was there. Then, knock. This time, it came from the window beside him. Mark stumbled back, nearly dropping his phone. His breath came in short gasps as he forced himself to look. There was no one there. His pulse pounded in his ears. His skin felt ice cold. The knocking continued, moving around the house. First the front door, then the back, then the side window, then the garage door. It wasn't just knocking anymore. It was circling him. Mark rushed to the bedroom, locking the door behind him. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his hands trembling. The line rang once, twice, then a soft click, silence. Hello, Mark whispered. No response, but he heard breathing, slow, ragged, right in his ear. Mark hung up, his entire body shaking. Then the final knock came. It was right outside his bedroom door. He couldn't breathe. His eyes locked on the doorknob, waiting for it to turn. Then something worse happened. The voice, soft, gentle, almost familiar. Mark. His blood ran cold. It knew his name. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He could only listen as the voice whispered again. Let me in. Mark stood frozen, his breath shallow, his body refusing to move. The bedroom door loomed before him, and beyond it, the thing that had called his name. It hadn't knocked again. It didn't need to. Instead, it waited. The air was thick with silence, but Mark swore he could hear something just beyond the door. A soft, rhythmic sound. Not breathing, not shuffling, whispering. It was faint, like someone speaking just beneath their breath. Words he couldn't make out, like a language he didn't understand. He gripped his phone tightly, but his mind was blank. Who could he call? The police? He had tried that, and all he got was that thing. He forced himself to move, backing away from the door as quietly as he could. His foot brushed against the edge of his bed, and the mattress creaked slightly. The whispering stopped. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. Then, click, the doorknob turned slightly. Not enough to open, just enough to test. He bit his lip to keep from gasping. It knew he was inside. It knew he was awake. Slowly, Mark reached for the lamp on his nightstand and yanked the cord from the wall, plunging the room into darkness. He moved towards the closet, his mind racing. If he hid, maybe it would go away. Maybe it would think he had left. Click, click. The doorknob turned again, this time more forcefully. Mark dove into the closet, pressing himself into the corner. His breaths came in short gasps. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to be silent. Then, the door creaked open. Not the closet, the bedroom door. A chill swept over him as he heard it. Soft footsteps, slow and deliberate. Moving closer. The thing was inside his room. Mark could barely breathe. He pressed his hands over his mouth, his pulse hammering against his skull. The whispering began again. It was right outside the closet. Then, knock, knock, from inside the closet. Mark's stomach dropped. The knock hadn't come from the bedroom door. It hadn't come from the walls. It had come from behind him, from inside the closet. A slow, crawling realization spread through him. The thing outside the closet wasn't alone. He felt it before he saw it. A breath, cold and damp, brushed against the back of his neck. A voice, so close it felt like it was whispering straight into his ear. Let me in. Mark bolted. He didn't think. He just moved, throwing himself out of the closet. He ran for the bedroom door. The thing in the closet shrieked, a horrible, gurgling sound that didn't belong to anything human. Mark yanked the door open and sprinted down the hallway, his vision blurred with terror. The house felt suffocatingly dark, but he didn't care. He needed to get out. As he reached the front door, his fingers fumbled with the locks. Then he froze. Something was standing on the other side, a shadow, tall, motionless, and it was knocking. The knocking at the front door was slow, deliberate, almost amused. Mark stood frozen, his back pressed against the doorframe, his fingers hovering over the deadbolt. He could see it through the frosted glass, a tall, shadowy figure standing just beyond the door. Knock, knock. It was waiting. His entire body screamed at him to run, to hide, to do anything but what his trembling hand was about to do. His fingers inched toward the lock, not because he wanted to open the door, because something wanted him to. Mark clenched his teeth and forced himself to stop. He took a deep, shuddering breath and stepped back. The knocking stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, there was silence. Then, thud, something heavy slammed against the door. Mark stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. His mind raced. What the hell was this thing? It had been inside his house. He had felt its breath, heard its whispers. Now it was outside, knocking as if it had never been there in the first place. No, not as if. It wanted him to think it was outside. His stomach twisted. A horrible realization settled in his gut. What if it wasn't outside at all? What if it was still inside? A floorboard creaked behind him. The air turned thick, heavy. He could feel it. Something was standing in the hallway, just out of sight. Mark didn't move, didn't breathe. A faint whisper slithered through the darkness. Let me in. Slowly, he turned his head. A shape stood in the hallway. It wasn't quite human. It was tall, too tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its limbs were impossibly thin. Its skin stretched too tightly over its bones. But the worst part was its face. Or rather, the lack of one. There were no eyes, no mouth, no features. Just smooth, pale skin stretched over its skull. Yet somehow it was smiling, not with lips or teeth, but with something deeper, something unseen. Mark's breath came in short, panicked gasps. The thing tilted its head, its body moving in a slow, unnatural motion. Then it raised one long, bony hand. Knock! It tapped the wall beside it, mimicking the sound from before. Knock! Knock! Mark bolted. He sprinted past the creature, not daring to look back. He heard it move, heard the sound of bones cracking as it twisted toward him. But he didn't stop. He ran for the back door, yanking it open and stumbling into the night. Cold air slapped against his face as he crashed onto the damp grass of his backyard. His breath came in ragged gasps. Inside, the house was silent. But something was wrong. The house looked different. The windows were dark, too dark. Not the kind of darkness that came from a lack of light, but the kind that absorbed light. The shadows inside weren't just shadows. They were alive. The knocking started again. Not from the doors. Not from the windows. From everywhere. Knock, knock. From the walls. Knock, knock. From the roof. Knock, knock. From inside his own skull. Mark fell to his knees, clutching his head. The sound was deafening, drilling into his bones. Then, silence. Mark lifted his head. The house was gone. In its place was a door, a massive old wooden door, standing alone in the middle of his yard. The handle turned, and slowly, the door began to open. Mark stared at the impossible door standing in the middle of his backyard. It shouldn't have been there. His house was gone, swallowed by the darkness. But in its place stood the door. Old, wooden, wrong. It was opening. The creak of its hinges sent a sharp chill through his spine. The space beyond it was not like the night around him. It was deeper, darker, a void that seemed to breathe. Mark scrambled backward, his heart slamming against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. From the other side of the door came the whisper, "Let me in." His blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't coming from inside the void. It was coming from behind him. Slowly, stiffly, Mark turned his head. The faceless thing stood just inches away. Its tall, skeletal frame loomed over him, its head cocked to the side. It had no mouth, no eyes. Yet Mark could feel its gaze piercing into him. Knock! Knock! It lifted a bony hand and rapped its knuckles against his forehead, mimicking the sound that had haunted him all night. Mark jerked away, his breath ragged. The thing moved closer. Knock! It tapped against his chest. Knock! His skull. "Let me in," it whispered. The words coiled around him like a serpent, squeezing the breath from his lungs. His vision blurred. The world spun. The door was waiting. A gust of wind howled from the open void, carrying whispers. Hundreds, maybe thousands, all murmuring at once. Then he saw them. Hands, pale, clawed fingers reaching through the darkness, stretching toward him. Their touch would be ice, would be death. Mark knew it. But the faceless thing behind him didn't push him forward. It waited. Knock. A final tap against his chest. Then he understood. It wasn't trying to force its way in. It was waiting for him to invite it. His mind twisted with the horror of realization. This thing had never needed the door to open. It had needed him to open, to let it in. Mark clenched his teeth, forcing his body to move. "No!" he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. The thing stiffened. The whispers from the door screeched in rage. The hands in the void clawed desperately, pulling at the edges of reality itself. Mark pushed himself to his feet, stumbling backward. "No!" he said again, louder this time. The faceless thing's head twitched. Then it lunged. Mark ran. He sprinted into the darkness, the whispers shrieking behind him. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if reality itself was unraveling. He didn't look back, didn't stop, didn't listen. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until the world around him blurred into nothing. And then silence. The night was gone. The whispers had stopped. Mark opened his eyes. He was standing in front of his house, his real house. The porch light flickered gently. The door was closed. Everything looked normal. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? His hand shook as he reached for his phone. 3 a.m. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. It had to be, didn't it? Then, knock, knock. His stomach dropped. The sound came from inside the house. Knock, knock. The sound echoed from inside the house. Mark's breath hitched. His fingers trembled as he reached for the doorknob. He didn't want to open it, but he had to. Slowly, he turned the handle and stepped inside. The house was silent, dark, unchanged. His couch, his TV, his half-empty glass of water on the coffee table. Everything was just as he had left it, except for the door at the end of the hall. It was open, the bedroom door. Mark's stomach twisted into knots. He had locked it before he ran. He was sure he had locked it. A breath of cold air drifted from the darkened room, carrying something else with it. A whisper, "Let me in." Mark staggered backward, slamming into the wall. His heart pounded in his chest. It wasn't over. The thing was still here. The knocking came again, but not from the bedroom, not from the front door, not from the windows. It was coming from inside his head. Knock, knock. Mark's vision blurred. The walls of his house shifted, as if they were breathing, pulsing like something alive. His body felt heavy, his limbs sluggish, his thoughts tangled together, his mind fogging over. A new fear gripped him. It wasn't trying to get inside anymore. It already was. "No," Mark whispered. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his hands against his skull. He could feel it now, crawling through his mind like a parasite, digging deep, planting itself in the darkest parts of him. "No," he repeated, stronger this time. But the whispers grew louder. "Let me in." The walls around him twisted. The door at the end of the hall stretched taller, wider, swallowing the darkness. The floor groaned beneath his feet. Mark dropped to his knees, his hands shaking violently. Then he remembered. The knocking had never been about the house. It had never been about the door. It had always been about him. This thing, whatever it was, couldn't take him by force. It needed him to invite it in. Mark gritted his teeth. He wouldn't let it. His eyes snapped open. No. The whispers screamed. The walls cracked. The door at the end of the hall slammed shut. Mark gasped, his head snapping back. And then, silence. The house was still. Normal. The bedroom door was closed. The air was warm again. The knocking was gone. Mark's whole body trembled as he forced himself to his feet. His mind was clear. The presence was gone. He staggered toward the front door and yanked it open, gasping in the cool night air. His chest heaved as he stared into the quiet street. For the first time in hours, he felt free. It was over. It had to be. Mark exhaled sharply, pressing his back against the doorframe. The night was calm, peaceful, no knocking, no whispers. Then, a soft vibration in his pocket. His phone. With shaking hands, he pulled it out. A single notification glowed on the screen. A missed call. No number. No name. Just a message. "Let me in." Mark's blood ran cold. Then, knock, knock, right behind him. The screen of his phone flickered. The text changed. "You already did." Mark's breath caught. The light bulb above him buzzed and went out. The door behind him slowly opened. The end